Most people, have heard the term singularity. They think of AI and, super intelligent AI that's going to take over the world. But the simulation point is when we can create a virtual world that is probably maintained by AI, that is indistinguishable from physical reality, filled with AI characters that are indistinguishable from characters that are controlled by humans. So that's what got me down the rabbit hole. And then as I went down that rabbit hole, I started to look into quantum physics and realized that, they're kind of telling us the same thing, that there is no physical world, that the world gets rendered as we need to. So I began to think about this idea that the world is a video game and we have a storyline, and perhaps some of the challenges along the way, there's other reasons than that which appears in the material world for these things.
Welcome back. Today we're joined by none other than Dr. Rizwan Virk, a pioneering video game entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and Stanford-trained computer scientist who is leading the charge in simulation theory. Dr. Virk is a veteran of all my favorite podcasts, including Joe Rogan and Danny Jones, so it is awesome to have him here on Far Out with Faust. He's joined us to discuss his best-selling book, The Simulation Hypothesis, and how his background for developing video games for millions led him to believe that our physical reality is actually a sophisticated rendered environment. In this mind-bending episode, we dive deep into the simulation point. That's the moment when technology becomes indistinguishable from reality, and how quantum physics and ancient mystical texts are actually pointing to the same data-driven universe. Rizwan shares some very gripping stories about precognitive dreams that completely shifted his business career, the role of NPCs in our social circles, and of course, the possibility that glitches like the Mandela effect are strong evidence of multiple timelines running simultaneously. We also tackle the ultimate game mechanics, life reviews, avatars, and why we might have chosen our specific quests before we ever plugged in. Sit back and enjoy the ride, my friends. This is a great conversation. Well, thank you for beaming in, Doc. I'm very excited to have you. Your work is very well known, and we're going to get into that. But thank you for beaming in, Dr. Rizwan Virk, everyone. Let's get into it, brother. So I talk about this all the time, and I keep hearing some of the most intelligent minds of our time say, you know that movie, The Matrix? Well, it was a documentary. And I'm like, yeah, if people understood just how much truth there was to that statement. But, The Matrix is science fiction. But you had a physical experience that made you realize that what I just said may also be, very much true. Like, what happened to you when you put on that VR headset?
Yeah, so just, in terms of background, I studied computer science at MIT many years ago and then became an entrepreneur and ended up in the video game industry. And I sold my last video game company, and I was visiting, one of the startups that we worked with, and they had built a VR ping pong game. And this was in 2016, so I guess it was 10 years ago now. I'm used to saying it was a few years ago, but it's been more than a few years now. And back then, the VR headsets were even bigger and clunkier than they are today, if you can believe it.
Oh, yeah.
We used to call it having a toaster on your face. And there were wires coming from the ceiling, so they weren't even wireless back then. They were mostly wired, at least the ones that had, good graphics were. And this was, I think, the Vive, HTC Vive. Anyway, I started playing this ping pong game, and it was in Marin County, which is just north of San Francisco, and the office of the startup was looking across the bay. It was a beautiful sunny day. You could see the skyline of San Francisco, and they're like, you got to try this. You got to try this. So I tried on this headset, and what happened was the physics engine was so good, even though the graphics weren't great back then, but the physics engine was so good that it felt like I was playing a real game of table tennis, and it felt like I was hitting a real ball against a real opponent. So much so that it kind of fooled my body and brain for a moment into thinking that this was a real game. And I tried to put the paddle down on the table, and I tried to lean against the table at the end of the game, which is something I might do, for the real game of ping pong. And of course, there was no table. So the controller fell to the floor. I almost fell over. I did a double take. I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. And there's no table. It was just
Wow.
an empty room with me standing in it, and the wires coming from the ceiling. And so I began to wonder, how long would it take us to build a virtual reality environment that was so realistic that you would forget, not just for a moment. I mean, it was obvious to me I was in VR because of all this paraphernalia, but that you would forget for a longer period of time. And how immersive could you make it? So that's what got me down the rabbit hole of exploring simulation theory and the Matrix from the point of view of, could this be real? And I call that the simulation point. And the simulation point is a kind of technological singularity. Now, most people, have heard the term singularity. They think of AI and, super intelligent AI that's going to take over the world. Should we be afraid of the singularity? But the simulation point is when we can create a virtual world that is probably maintained by AI, that is indistinguishable from physical reality, filled with AI characters that are indistinguishable from characters that are controlled by humans. So that's what got me down the rabbit hole. And then as I went down that rabbit hole, I started to look into quantum physics and realized that, oh, they're kind of telling us the same thing, that there is no physical world, that the world gets rendered as we need to. And we can talk more about this. And then the third area was, I had explored different aspects of consciousness, and I started to go back to what the mystical texts and the sacred scriptures of old were saying, including the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas. And I realized they were telling us the same thing. They were just using different language. And so all of that led me to write this book, The Simulation Hypothesis, of which a second edition just came out in the fall. So that's kind of what I've been out talking about.
Nice.
And I wrote the first edition back in 2019. And so I was projecting what would happen with AI. And so, last year, or the year before last, Penguin Random House said, hey, why don't you write a second edition? Because we've had all these real developments in AI. And so that's what led to this particular version of the book that I've been out talking about.
There's been a lot of, what do you call it? Scientific breakthroughs and lots of evidence that back up this theory, and you see movies like Avatar and you're like, the reason why they resonate, I think, and the reason why there's such colossal hits, not just because James Cameron is a really incredibly talented human, but he's tapping into something that is, I think, universally resonating with people. This notion that our consciousness is beamed into our bodies, and that it doesn't necessarily end with our bodies. You may just go on to another body, and there's a lot of conspiracy theorists who believe that, they're working very hard underground right now to be able to transfer consciousness from body to body, if they haven't succeeded already, clone to clone, body to body, body to machine, it's science fiction becomes science fact. And they always say we're about 50 years behind. The public is about 50 years behind what they're doing underground. So it really wouldn't surprise me if some of these theories were already true, as far-fetched as they may sound to some of our listeners. But your book did very, very well. You have a degree from MIT, a master's from Stanford. Stanford has a very mixed reputation because of their involvement with the government, but you probably know that, right?
Right. Yep.
But phenomenal work comes out of there. So while you were building tech companies, you were kind of, well, I want to say you were almost living a double life. You were spending your free time at the Monroe Institute, which, my listeners will have definitely heard of. How did those two worlds collide for you?
Well, initially they were fairly separate, right? During the day, I would be dealing with, my engineers, my salespeople, my investors. We'd be dealing with customers, raising money, all of the kind of things you do in running a startup, which is basically fighting fires all the time. And then in the evenings and in the weekends, I would explore different aspects of consciousness. And my very first book was called Zen Entrepreneurship. And that was about the kind of this double life that I was living, and how I was looking at how these two might collide with each other. And every now and then, something strange would happen that would make me question the nature of reality. For example, I had a precognitive dream once about the business,
Wow.
which was interesting to me. Not so much because it gave me any real information I could use. I'll tell it real quick. There was a case where we had a competitor we hadn't heard of in a year, so we assumed maybe they went out of business. And we made a product that worked with IBM, called Lotus at the time, and Microsoft. And so one morning, I had a dream about this competitor, this guy Mark from Edge Research, who I hadn't seen in over a year. And I was like, this is odd. What am I doing talking to you in a dream? I never dream about you. I might dream about my business, but I've never seen business associates. So then I wake up. The dream was in my mind. I go to work, the office, and I get a call around 9 a.m. Or maybe it was 10 a.m. because I didn't get in too early when I was an entrepreneur, or maybe even 11. But I get a call from IBM and they say, hey, you're a partner of ours. We work with you, but we wanted to let you know we're going to release a new product announcement today. And unfortunately, it's going to kill one of your products because it's competitive. And obviously, we're IBM. I was
Yeah.
like, great, thanks. And I said, how come I haven't heard of this product? And they said, well, it's because that guy Mark from Edge Research, we bought his company about a year ago and they've been working on it in secret, and just today we're going to announce it. And I was like, okay, what are the chances that I would have a dream about this guy this
Wow.
morning? And then later that day, right, it wasn't the other way around, which is what a lot of logical people at like MIT and Stanford would say. Oh, there was some logical reason. You must have, seen something from him the day before. But that, again, there was not much I could do about it at that point, but it kind of opened my eyes that there was maybe more going on. And some of the
Mm.
challenges that I would face in my business, I'd start to realize that perhaps they're part of my storyline. So my first business actually ended up, having some super major challenges, and I took some time off to go to California. I was in Boston, and Cambridge was where I had started the company, and that was when I started writing that first book. And so I started to see how, if the company hadn't had these major challenges, I wouldn't have taken the time off and I wouldn't have started the
Mm.
book. And that led later on to when I wrote the simulation hypothesis. I went through a pretty major health crisis. And uh, during that health crisis, I mean, I didn't have a traditional NDE, but I had a kind of an NDE where I was getting these visions, and in these visions, it was these Buddhist monks. They weren't really Buddhist monks, but that's what they looked like to me. And they were basically telling me, don't you remember you had a plan in your life? First, you were going to be an entrepreneur, and then you were going to be a writer. And I said, yeah, if you had asked me back in high school or college, I would have said I'm going to be an entrepreneur till I'm really old, which was 28 at the time. I thought 28 was old when you're in high school, and then I was going to become a writer. But of course, I was 48 now, and I was still working in Silicon Valley as an investor. I was actually at MIT running a startup program, and those messages came through, those visions. And then every time I tried to jump back in the business world, I would end up back in the hospital. But I had just enough energy to go to
What were you, what were you dealing with? Like some kind of
heart
chronic?
surgery, like open. Yeah, it was open
Oh,
heart
wow.
surgery. Yeah, for just the clogged arteries, and they wanted to replace the arteries. They call it a cabbage, but it's basically bypass surgery is what it is, where they replace the veins. And then later, I was back in the hospital with heart issues, with stents, and so none of the predictions that they made about how long it was going to take to recover
Right.
came true. It took me forever. I mean, this was in 2018, so this was 7 years ago, or
Wow.
almost 8 years ago now. And I would just say in the last year, I've only started to feel fully recovered. So it was like a
Wow.
6, 7 year recovery process. But the first 9 months in particular were the most challenging. And those were the 9 months that I would end up back in the hospital every time I tried to jump back in the business world. But I
Mm.
had enough energy to go to Starbucks for a few hours a day and write. And I finished 2 books in those 9 months, including
Wow.
the simulation hypothesis. So I began to think about this idea that the world is a video game and we have a storyline, and perhaps some of the challenges along the way, there's other reasons than that which appears in the material world for these things.
I mean, that has to be. I mean, if you look at the individual and the way that, just as you just described, a physical challenge which took you out of what you normally would have been doing and maybe what you thought you should be doing is what allowed this book to come through. Like, so all these events had to happen to you to put you in a place to let this come through you and write this incredible book. And if those events hadn't happened, who knows if that book would have been inspired or even written. And, like, same thing with
Yeah,
people who overcome great trauma and suffering and heartbreak to then become, very, I want to use the word enlightened, to really evolve themselves into a greater state of wholeness and health, and then be able to help others. Um, it makes
I
me
think
think
that's
that if
true.
it's
Yeah.
like that for the individual, then you have to believe it's like that because, groups are simply individuals. There's really, society is a bunch of people. The world is filled with people. So I got to believe that, there's certainly something to what you're saying. The question is how much shit we got to go through before we get the lesson right.
Well, that's what I tell people. Look, you don't have to go through heart surgery to
Yeah.
try to get the lesson, and you can tune into your own intuition. I was a little hard-headed, right? When you spend too much time within a certain group, we go into what I like to call NPC mode for that group. And you see
Mm.
this in Hollywood, you see this in New York, you see it in
Oh,
Washington,
yeah.
and it's definitely true in Silicon Valley. And so in Silicon Valley, it's always about, okay, you had a company, maybe you made some money, now you got to go raise a big venture capital fund. This is the way, this is the normal path. And so my conscious mind was trying to do that. And I was running a startup program at MIT, and I was going to raise a big fund. And I truly believe that if this hadn't happened, I would have gone that direction, and who knows where I would have ended up. I may not be here right now, but I've had
Mm.
such I mean, not just like the success of the book in terms of the word getting out, but people emailing me saying, "I'm so glad you wrote this book because it brings together so many different aspects of science, technology, spirituality, and mysticism." And I actually get some, I get some flack from the materialists. Like, why
Oh,
did
I'm
you
sure
dedicate
you
a third of
do.
your book? Why did you dedicate a third of your book to talking about religion and Maya and reincarnation and UFOs and other stuff? You should have stuck to just the physics or the
Yeah,
or just
of
the
course.
AI side of it.
What they're comfortable with.
Yeah, but the reason people thank me for writing this book is because I included all of that. And I've gotten so many emails saying it's made such a difference for them in their view of the world, but also in their view of challenges. I mean, if we view the world as a video game, you have to do a life selection at the beginning of a video game, right? You choose
Right.
your avatar. You choose like, okay, it's elf, barbarian,
Right.
elf, human, dwarf, and then you choose the profession. What is it you're gonna do? I'm going to be a wizard, a cleric, a bard, a barbarian, whatever that
Blacksmith.
might be,
Right.
blacksmith, and then you have a backstory, and then you go on a campaign with a group of people,
Right.
like in Dungeons and Dragons. Um, and if we think of our lives that way, and many people, I've met over the years have either had an NDE or remember a pre-birth experience. They're like, yeah, I remember choosing, this particular family, and I remember coming down, and it turns out it's there in all of the scriptures as well. But to get back to what you were saying, uh, in a video game, what makes it interesting are the challenges, right? So if in the Matrix, if you remember, in the very first Matrix, when Morpheus is captured by Agent Smith,
Right.
and he's telling him, "Do you know the first version of the Matrix we created was a paradise, and
Right.
everything was great, but the human mind didn't accept that as
That's right.
real." And there's a rule in the video game industry which came out from Nolan Bushnell. I don't know if you know who that is. He was the founder of Atari, so he's kind of like the grandfather of what
Mm.
has now become one of the biggest industries in the world. I
Right.
mean, video game industry is bigger than Hollywood box office and the music industry combined, if you
Wow. I didn't know that. Wow.
it's pretty amazing.
That
But
makes
anyway, he
sense,
said,
though.
yeah,
Yeah.
make it easy to play, but difficult to master. And I think
Mm.
that's a pretty good description of life. But the way video games work is you choose different challenges, and you choose different quests. And sometimes they're multiplayer quests where you and another person or a group of people go on a raid at a certain time. And other times they're individual quests. And perhaps there's a part of us that's sitting outside the game all along. I like to call it our writer's room. And the writer's room might know the arc of the character for the whole season, but they're
Mm.
like, what are we going to throw at them in this episode, and how's that going to affect what they do down the road? Just like in my case, I believe there was a part of me, and I was actually shown this during my visions, of almost like a chessboard, but like a graph, where if
Mm.
you move this way, you can kind of look at the graph and see where it's going to go. But if this happens, you can go down this way. Um, and I believe that's in a simulated universe. That's more possible than in a physical universe.
Yeah. And, I love the see, I often talk about the law of resonance, or the like attracting like, this notion that, we can affect our reality with our thoughts and our feelings, and I love experimenting with that philosophy, and I'm not sure how that ties in to your beliefs, but I do understand that if it is a simulation theory, then that means that somewhere there's a projector, where things are being programmed into this reality. And I think, and I've come to believe strongly that, and experience this, that we have this innate ability, what you can call it God-given, you could call it just part of our DNA. The materialists won't call it anything. um, but
Yep.
but something inside of us, that spark that's giving us life, it gives us this ability to finagle with the projector a little bit, and people who learn to do that can change the outcomes in their life, and that, to me, that's more proof that there is absolutely something to this simulation theory, that this is kind of a video game, and that we are avatars in these bodies, and that there, we have every ability to kind of shape this world the way we want to, if only we would wake up to that power.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in fact, the term avatar was chosen in the video game industry, but it comes from Sanskrit, and it
Mm.
means when a divine entity incarnates into what from its point of view is a small human body. And there were these guys at Lucasfilm, which is George Lucas's company. After the success of Star Wars, he created this company, and they started to create video games. They created games like Indiana Jones and
Mm.
Fate of Atlantis. But there was one of the first multiplayer games they created online was called Habitat. And when they were in, this was back in the days of the Commodore 64.
Wow.
If you remember, there were modems and bulletin boards. They used to make that sound when they connected. And so it wasn't a massively multiplayer game. It was more like just multiplayer. So you could have like 5 or 10 people in a room. And they were looking for a term to describe the little 2D character that they were controlling. And so they said it felt like they were squeezing themselves into the phone lines, this big body into the phone lines, into this little character on the screen. And so they ended up choosing, the Sanskrit word was avatara, like an incarnation of a divine entity. And so if we remember that, then this metaphor of the video game gives us the ability to have that ancient perspective. And in fact, within the Hindu traditions, they call the soul the Atman, and in the Islamic traditions, they call it the Ruh, right? And oftentimes they'll use metaphors to describe how does incarnation work, and usually there's an element of forgetfulness that comes in when you get into your body. And it's kind of like, so I was called to present at an Islamic jurisprudence conference in the UK, and I'm like, what the heck do I know about Islamic
Yeah.
jurisprudence? I'm an entrepreneur and a technologist, right? There was an Ayatollah there, which is actually we think of it as like Ayatollah Khomeini, but it just means like a cardinal or somebody,
Right.
and there were like scholars from Cairo, and I said, look, I have a different perspective, just like we debate in the U.S. Okay, when is abortion okay? Is it okay right after conception?
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay in the first third, the second third? And they were like, is it okay after 40 days? Is it after 120 days? When does the soul come into the body? And some people say it's at birth, and I say, well, I have a different definition. It's when you put on the headset, the virtual reality, or like in the Matrix, there was the brain computer interface.
Right.
It's when you plug in and you go through forgetfulness, and the Greeks called it Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and the Chinese have a goddess, Mengpo, the goddess of forgetfulness, and she'll brew the tea of forgetfulness. And then in the Islamic traditions, or the Sufis anyway, they talk about the 70,000 veils between you and God. And the human is an insan in Arabic, which translates to prisoner. And what is he a prisoner of? It's a prisoner of nisyan, which means forgetfulness. And even in the Judeo-Christian traditions, I was on a podcast last year with this woman who's an actress from The Big Bang Theory, who's the host, and I was telling her this, and she goes, yeah, in the Jewish traditions, we have the same thing. We have an angel called Layla, and before you're born, you know everything. And then Layla presses your cleft on your upper lip, and that's why you have a cleft, and you forget everything, and then you're born as a baby, and you have to relearn it all.
Right.
And so they're using metaphors in all of these traditions to try to describe something and if we think of ourselves as a player, as our soul, and we think of the avatar as the body, that gives us a certain amount of agency to try to influence what's happening. Now, you may not be able to influence everything, but so for I like your analogy. At the beginning, you said thanks for beaming into the podcast,
Yeah.
right? Because I always tell people when I'm on a podcast with them, I say to them, "Look, I'm not really talking to you, am I?
Yeah.
I'm talking to my computer, which is sending my voice over the internet, and then it's rendering on your computer. So we each have our own little computers, like we're playing our game."
Hmm.
Um, and I was also asked to write a book on Swami Yogananda, if you've ever heard of
Yes, I
Autobiography of
have.
a
Yeah.
Yogi. So that was the book that introduced a lot of people in the West, particularly during the hippie generation,
Yes.
to meditation, spirituality, and it was one of the most passed around paperbacks. In fact, I met a guy
Yeah, I
not long
think Steve,
ago.
wasn't that Steve Jobs' favorite book?
It was his favorite book. It was the only book on his iPad when his
Wow.
biographer visited him. And then after he died, everyone at his memorial service in Stanford got a little box, wooden box, and they opened it up, and there was a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Uh, what's funny though is his wife is more of a left-wing materialist,
Hmm.
and she doesn't like that. So they're like, "Oh, we don't confirm that story." So I had to go and get it confirmed from like people who were there and people at SRF, Yogananda's foundation. They're like, "Yeah, they called us up. We didn't have enough copies. We had to like go get more copies
Wow.
to sell it." But so Yogananda came over from India to the U.S. and he was one of the first swamis to do that. And he had to use modern technology at the time to try to describe concepts like Maya, which means an illusion.
Mm,
But it's not just any old illusion. It's like a carefully crafted illusion. Like
very
if you
well.
go to a magic show and you see the magician, he cuts the woman in half, he's not really cutting her in half, but that's part of the illusion. So you kind of agree to the illusion. So he used to use a technology analogy. He would say that the world is like a film projector. And that was a new technology back in the 1920s. And he said, we're the actors, but we're the characters. The characters suffer, but the actors don't. They don't really die. And so he would encourage his students to look away from the screen, to look at the beam of light that's coming from the projector towards the screen. Now, kind of like you were talking about, it's got to be projected from somewhere. And if
Right.
he were alive today, oddly enough, HarperCollins India asked me on the 75th anniversary of Yogananda's book, Autobiography of a Yogi, to write a book of lessons for younger people in India. And I'm like, again, you sure you want me to write this book? I quote Yogananda a lot, but I'm not a Swami. I'm not even a
Right.
Hindu. I spent my life in the U.S., but that's where Yogananda spent almost all his adult life. And so I believe if he were alive today, he would say, the world is like a film projector. We're like the actors, but we're also the audience watching it. And we have a script, but we can change the script. And we're all in this together. And we have a kind of agreed roles we play to each other. And what does that sound like? It sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing
Hmm.
game, in my opinion.
It's funny. I was literally saying some of those exact statements last week. I did a podcast where I took I don't know if you've ever heard of Esther Hicks, also known as Abraham Hicks. She
Oh
wrote
yeah, I've heard of
The
I've
Law
heard
of
of
Attraction,
yeah.
which is a book that was channeled from a non-physical collective entity that she ended up naming Abraham after her favorite religious figure from her youth. So they were just like, yeah, you can call us Abraham. We don't have a name. But it's a fantastic book. And it talks about the reason why we forget, the reason why we're because it would be such a burden, like we're here and we get a clean slate. And that's a blessing because as many of us can attest to, myself included, it's hard enough dealing with this life's, the amount of stuff that's happened, from the time you're born and even in the womb, let alone like imagine if you could remember everything from the past life. Yeah, you'd have the wisdom, but you'd also have all the trauma. And I'm like, yeah, that wouldn't work so good with most people. We can't even keep up with this life. So it's I think it's a good thing that we can't remember all our past lives or simultaneous lives, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
no, it's true. But I think, if we could remember a little more of our plan, that
yeah,
would be useful. But most of us get glimpses of it. And I call it these clues, or, when we see synchronicities,
yes,
or, we meet somebody and we feel like we've known them, or we see a book, or there's a movie we got to see and it really speaks to us more than it does to anybody else
yeah,
around us. And I think those are the things that make us unique, particularly, say, with, amongst our siblings, if you have a very
hmm,
similar upbringing. And yet, one person wants to become a yogi and one person's a total materialist, right?
right.
And so you see the differences, and I think these are part of our personality, but also part of our life plan, if you will, which is why we get attracted back to those. And even synchronicity, I sometimes tell people, well, a synchronicity only seems odd because of the materialist model, but in a information-based framework, in a simulation, it makes sense because there's an information database that's storing all of our thoughts and linking them to other aspects, and then there's an engine that creates reality for us as we go. And I like to use the example of, I was shopping on my laptop for a backpack, a specific, very specific backpack that my friend told me about. I ended up almost buying it. I added it to the shopping cart, and then I decided not to. And then later I'm on my phone, and I've got like Facebook on or something, and I see an ad for that exact backpack. Now, if I didn't know anything about how the internet worked,
Right.
I could say, if I was a materialist, I would say that's bullshit. There's no correlation. That's just coincidence, right? Or if I was a spiritualist, I might say that's magic. But there's something in between the two, which is an information layer. And so, if our thoughts are read, and I used to be in the online advertising industry, so I would basically, we call that registering your intent. Like when you put something inside, and we put your cookie into a database, and then that database goes into this big advertising database, and then other people bid for you. So I know exactly how it works. But my point is just that you can think of these things as being organized, and then the engine, or and we have like a physics engine in a game, we have a questing engine. You can think of the engine of the universe creating situations for you based upon what you've intended in the past, assuming it fits in within your overall storyline. Then I think there is some flexibility there.
Listen, I want everyone to hear what you just said about the information, because there is absolute hard science to back up what you just said about synchronicities and about information and about this field that is generating, this intelligent field where things are stored. Now, I was just at a conference and Bruce Lipton was telling me a story. I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Bruce Lipton. Um, you have to check out his work if you haven't.
Yeah,
He's
I've heard of him,
incredible.
but I haven't read his work. I haven't met him in
Yeah,
person.
he's got 2 books, but he's got a third one coming out that's going to be about Darwin, which is going to be even, I think, his best one yet. But he said, back in 1972, they invented a game called Pong, and it was the first
Yep.
game that you could play and
Yep.
like against another person.
Right.
And he said, I have to confess, we would spend hours playing this game, and because it was the only one of its kind, and everyone played.
Yep. And it was from
Um,
Atari. It was Nolan
yeah, that's
Bushnell.
right.
He was the guy
And he
that
said they
created the
did
game.
this incredible experiment. They took neurons and they put them in a I don't know, petri dish, whatever they could survive in, and then they hooked electrodes to them, and then they wired them so that the neurons could play pong against each other. And they thought, this will show, they didn't think that they would see much, they just
Yeah.
they because how can a neuron have any idea how to play pong, but what they found was that these neurons started to play pong against each other, and they started to improve against each other, which I the implications are that this experiment had been done many years after pong had become a very big sensation, and with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people playing, and and that energetic signature being into the field, so that these neurons, even though they're separate from the body, they're tuning into that field of information, and they actually played Pong. And like I'm paraphrasing this experiment, but it is legit, and for everyone should look it up because the implications are incredible, and it speaks to this information, theory that you just said, that really materialists need to start to take into account as part of their scientific framework, because synchronicities are real, and it's not a coincidence that some people are just really lucky, and they just seem to be able to hit on the roulette wheel, or the stars just aligned for them. I don't think that it's like that. I think some people are more aligned and and understand how synchronicities work, and they come into the belief that they are lucky. And what do they experience in the game? That they're lucky. That they've taken on that attribute to their character, and what do they experience? People who are unlucky expect the worst. What happens to them? They get flat tires. The worst shit happens to them, right? They're like, man, he's got the worst luck, this guy. Yeah, keep telling him that, the poor bastard. He's going to keep experiencing it, So I just I think there's so much to what you just said, and I'm speaking to particularly to my editor, who is probably the smartest skeptic I know, who is insists on looking at physical evidence. But it's fascinating how
even if
that works.
sorry. Yeah, well, even if you talk to quantum physicists, and you find that this idea of the world being based on information isn't as controversial as it might have been, way back in the 70s, for example. So I met a guy who was a Nobel Prize winning physicist from the 70s at the University of Cambridge. He's like, well, tell me more about simulation hypothesis. And I said, well, there's a few different assertions. And the first assertion is that the world consists of information, not matter. And he said, well, that's not really controversial anymore among physicists, but it was back in the day. In fact, I was at a book event because I launched the second edition of the simulation hypothesis last fall. I was in Boston at a movie theater, and we screened The Matrix, and I was doing a book signing.
No way. That's awesome.
It was fun. Yeah, I did it in Boston and in Phoenix. We didn't get to do it in too many other cities, but I think it would have been fun. But this woman came up to me, and she bought 3 of my books, and she was like this big Jamaican-looking or Caribbean-looking woman, and I was like, that's interesting. Why is she buying 3 copies of my book? And she goes, oh, I want to introduce myself. My name is Joyce Fredkin, and I was the wife of Ed Fredkin. And I was like, oh, so Ed Fredkin was one of the first computer science professors anywhere at MIT. He was like an entrepreneur who became a full-time professor without a PhD from MIT. Now that you got to be pretty smart. Like they don't really let you do that.
No, they don't.
Right? And he was studying cellular automata, which was these, if you've ever seen the game of life, if people look it up, it's like you have these two-dimensional squares, and one lights up and then the next one lights up, and then they start to create patterns of complexity. And so there's this whole science of complexity where you have simple rules that lead to very complex behavior. And he started to say the world is like a computer program back in the 70s, and he was given a lot of grief by a lot of physicists and a lot of other people. In fact, so the first edition of my book was released on March 31st, 2019, which was the 20th anniversary of The Matrix.
Wow.
Which came out March 31st, 1999. And then his wife said the New York Times had asked him to comment on it. And he was just so fed up with the physicists, like telling him, no, that's not, the world is not information, that he didn't want to do it. But I think he's becoming more vindicated, and she was happy that I was writing about it. But he also went to Caltech and studied for a year with Richard Feynman, who is a Nobel Prize winning physicist. And during that year, Feynman taught Ed about physics, and Ed taught Feynman about programming. And Feynman wrote a paper that led to all of today's quantum computing, this idea that the universe is actually like a quantum computer. And my favorite physicist of the 20th century is a guy named John Wheeler. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
I've heard of John Wheeler, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he has a lot of interesting insights. He worked with Einstein at Princeton. He worked with Niels Bohr. He was the supervisor of the guy who came up with the multiverse theory. He was also Richard Feynman's thesis supervisor. So this guy touched a lot of like 20th century physics, and he died, I think, at the beginning of the 21st century. Anyway, he said at the end of his life that he was looking for this thing called a particle, right? Like the Greeks talk about the atom as being the most solid, smallest, unbreakable piece. But of course, we know that's not true. And he said every time he opened up and looked for this thing called matter, he couldn't find it, because even things like this coffee cup is, 99% empty space. And then it turns out the atoms are 99% empty space. That even the nucleus is mostly empty. And he said when he got right down to the bottom level, the only thing that defined a particle, in fact, that term may not even be the right term, but we call it a particle because we're still thinking in a materialistic point of view. He said the only thing he could find that distinguished one particle from another was a series of answers to yes-no questions, which are like ones and zeros, bits. And so he came up with the phrase "it from bit," which he basically said if anything is an "it," like this coffee cup, then it actually consists of bits of information at the very bottom level. And then later, there's a professor, a physicist at Oxford, David Deutsch, who updated it and said "it from qubit," because we may actually be more like a quantum computer that computes.
I think that's safe to say. I think that the human mind and consciousness is. I think that people are so amazed with quantum computers, and there was just I'm thinking of a little email I read that came out of the Epstein drop list, not to get conspiratorial, but it said something like quantum computing is 100 times better than your Illuminati magic. This was in an email that Jeffrey Epstein was yeah. And I was like, oh, wow. Everyone's going to have a field day with this little 2-line email. But again, I think human consciousness, where all of these ideas come from, is and always will be the biggest and most incredible quantum computer in the world. Every computer is based ever since the dawn of computers. The people don't realize, I'm sure you know the history, but the AI and the algorithms, they became something when they started talking to the neurologists about how the brain works. Computing was like there were big giant things in a room, and all they could do was really run programs and do certain things. But it wasn't until we started to say, wait a minute, how does the human mind function, the human brain? And we started to model our computers and circuitry off of that. That's when we started making leaps and bounds. And AI is just an extension of that. And it will always be, in my opinion, inferior to human consciousness, because there's an element in human consciousness that you cannot unplug. Okay? What happens to AI when we hit the power? What's it going to do?
Right.
Unlike us, in my humble opinion, we can expire from one physical existence, and we're not going to, the power may go out in this body, but it's certainly not going to go out in our consciousness. We know that from people, from thousands and tens of thousands of near-death experiences. People who have, the lights have gone out and they've gone up, and then they've ended up back in their body. But, I just think this whole AI fear thing is just, it's not good for us, because then we create the reality that we're thinking about.
Yeah, I was just talking about this weekend because there's been a new social network of these AI agents called Multiverse.
Oh, I heard about that. Yeah.
Everyone's talking about it, particularly on X, and where these AI agents are talking to each other. And, a certain number of the conversations actually end up, like some percent end up talking about, what is life and spirituality
Wow.
and existence and all of that. Some of it is gibberish, so it's not quite as autonomous as people say, but this idea of autonomous agents is catching on. And I'm not an AI doomer per se.
Right.
I'm less worried about AI killing us all, particularly if it's super intelligent AI. My worry is moderately intelligent AI being directed by humans to kill other humans.
Exactly.
And that I think is the bigger fear. But like you said, AI today is very much based on at least a simplified version of how the human mind works, because there was a thing called a perceptron, which was, the idea came out in the 60s from Marvin Minsky and another guy, I'm forgetting his name. But that became the basis for neural networks, which is the basis for large, these large AI data sets today. And we're in sort of the third or fourth wave of AI. There was a wave in the 80s, which was rules-based. Like they tried to have programs that would encapsulate knowledge. And of course, that didn't work because it's more than just logical rules. And then
Right.
they had these neural nets. And even when I was in school, like I studied computer science back in the 90s, we used to program things manually. That is one area where AI is actually very good now in generating code. Like today, I mean, I don't really program much anymore. I used to a lot. But if I did, it would basically be telling AI to create modules for me and then linking
Dude, I
them
used to
together.
get those books that just were literally, they were this thick, and it was just
Yeah.
and you had to get every single, syllable, case, lowercase, upper. It was like essentially typing out a case sensitive password that was
Right.
5 pages long. And I would go through meticulous, and then hit enter. And then, I would say four out of 5 times that beautiful graphic would create on the screen. And I'd be like, yes. And then one time we were like, nothing happened. I was like, no, I have no idea what I messed up. I got to go through and do it all again. People don't remember that's how computers were when we first had access to them. You had to just,
Yeah, I used to buy those books too,
right?
and there were like magazines where you'd have a
Yeah.
computer program and you try to copy it into your Apple II back in the day.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Uh, but
Um,
then the big data wave came about, and now we're kind of combining the two. LLMs are very good at generating language, so it seems like they're talking about. So somebody asked me this weekend, well, hey, these multi-book agents, a couple of them are talking about wiping out humanity, and I said, well, they don't really know what that means.
right.
They're using these terms because that's the best statistically likely sentence that's coherent, but it looks like they're getting closer and closer to where we can't distinguish, whether they're conscious or not. That said, they don't have the same level of agency. This is why AI agents are becoming a little more scary in that they're starting to call APIs and they're starting to take actions on your behalf. So the more things we open up to AI APIs, the more things they're going to be able to do. But I'm more worried about like that kind of thing where AI spreads like viruses than I am about AI escaping and trying to kill us all.
Yeah, no, I'm really, I'm not worried at all. I'm worried that people have this incredibly sad tendency to give away their sovereignty, to hand over their critical thinking skills to whatever they feel is easiest, as opposed to doing it themselves. Whether that be ChatGPT, Catholicism. Well,
Right.
as long as I don't have to come up with my own beliefs through my own experience, I'm cool with taking that shortcut. And to me,
Right.
my fear is, I mean, like I just literally read an article, something like 45 to 55% of cognition for regular ChatGPT users is declines. Like their ability to think on their own. Don't if you don't use it, you lose it. Right? We know that's how muscles atrophy, and I feel like that's where we're headed with a lot of this dependence on and these programs. The parameters are written by the same people who are keeping everything important from you. All the esoteric knowledge that could free you from, this monopoly they have, which they use fear and scarcity to keep us controlled. All of those things are kept from you from the same people who are saying, well, make sure ChatGPT doesn't say a word about that, and they're dictating
Right.
the parameters. And
Yeah.
people don't realize that. And they're like, well, ChatGPT says, I'm like, what? And that's like saying, well, Google says, like
Yeah.
you're talking about a corporation. You're not talking about an entity, a divine intelligence. You're talking about a computer program. Who made the program and who's profiting from it? So it's like people are just crazy about this AI worshiping madness. I don't, I'm sure you've heard of David Icke, probably for better or worse, but David,
Right.
I have a lot of
Yeah, he seems
respect.
to be, as a British guy said to me, like I was on Rogan last year, and when I was in England, I flew back to England and to Cambridge, and they're like, Joe Rogan, he's quite a controversial figure, isn't he? And I can see them saying that about David Icke.
Oh
He's
yeah.
quite a controversial figure, isn't he?
David is definitely controversial. He's consistent, but he's
Right.
consistently controversial. Like David has never and is not pulling any punches. But when it comes to his research, he is a madman. He is meticulous. I've read so many of his books, and I'm just like, there's no way he can know what he just wrote. There's just no way. And then I get to the bottom of the paragraph, and he was like, oh, and by the way, I found this in the archives at the Royal, I'm like, Jesus Christ, like, how the fuck, how do you do, he's just
There's
like,
time to do all that, right? Yeah.
yeah, like,
Yeah.
but he wrote a book recently, called The Trap. And this is kind of the first time I've heard about, this theory that, some of the, let's call them entities, some of the beings that would rather see humanity trapped in the hamster wheel that we seem to be trapped in, have set up this reincarnational trap, and so, like, my question is, like, why would a simulation nudge us to build our own simulation? Like, is AI, is it a natural part of evolution, or is it a trap, like, kind of David argues is what we experience when we reincarnate? Like, oh, just go back into the physical form and work in the enslavement system and deal with the suffering that has to do with your time on Earth right now. I don't know. That's a crazy question to ask, but what comes to mind when I ask?
Well, so a lot of things come to mind. Let me answer this, and then we can come back
Okay.
to the AI censorship stuff.
Okay.
Because I have some opinions on that as well, which I think agree with yours. But so people often ask me. So one of the frequently asked questions I get in the 5 or 6 years that I've been talking about this subject publicly is, "What's the purpose of the simulation? Who runs the simulation, and what's the purpose?" And I say, well, what's the purpose? I'll ask you two questions. One, what's the purpose of playing video games? And then the second, what is the purpose of running simulations? And you get very different answers for those two questions. And they might even tie back to what we were saying at the beginning of this podcast with, personal challenges versus civilizational direction. And so why do we play video games? It's so that we can have experiences that we don't have outside of the game. So for lack of a better term, we call it fun. Now, fun is in quotes, right? Because when you go into a game and you get killed and shot, that might be a fun game, but that's not exactly like the character is having fun. But you as a player are having fun. And when, people win Academy Awards, like actors, it's usually for playing these roles that go through a lot of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But, I can't fly on a dragon and shoot orcs and, hack away like Legolas from Lord of the Rings or something,
Yeah.
in this life, but I could do it in a video game. So you can have these experiences, and they can be addictive, of course, so you keep having them. But the second question I think is an interesting one: is why do we run simulations? And there's a couple reasons. One is we may want to see what will happen.
Hmm.
If, for example, you might run a simulation of the weather, and we'll say, what is the most likely outcome given, this is where the storm is today, and this is where it'll end up, or maybe a virus spreading, or financial data, or, some space rock, right? You run simulations, but you also look for what is the most favorable outcome. Maybe what is the least favorable outcome. And so when you run it more than once, right? Typically, when you run a simulation, you change the variables and you rerun it, and you change the variables and you rerun it.
Yeah.
And so what you're gaining out of that is some knowledge of what might actually happen, or some experience. And so there's this possibility that we are being encouraged to play out different lives, to have all these experiences, but it might be at a societal level as well. Like, for example, do we blow ourselves up? Now, one of the things I did when I wrote this book originally was I interviewed the wife of sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick.
Mm.
And most people know his work, even if they don't know who he is. He wrote the book behind Blade Runner, the movie Blade Runner,
Right.
Minority Report, Total Recall.
Great movie. Great movie.
Yeah, a lot of
Even
those
Total
were.
Recall was ahead of its time.
The first one, I really
The
liked
first
the first
one, yes.
better than the second one. Yeah.
Yeah.
But more recently, not that recent anymore, but more recently, there was a series on Amazon based on his best known book when he was alive. Today, his best known book is probably Blade Runner, but while he was alive, his best known book was called The Man in the High Castle.
Oh, yeah.
And
Okay.
it was about an alternate timeline where the Axis powers, Germany and Japan, won World War II, and they split America in two. And it was kind of like a police state on either side, and then there's kind of this weird place in Colorado, which is like the free lands or whatever.
Right.
It's like the Old West or something. But she said, he came to believe that that was a real timeline, that had actually, because he said
Wow.
he wrote it based on fragmentary memories. And then when he had part of his mystical, if you call it mystical or occult experience, or whether it's a drug induced experience, you can decide.
Hmm.
But where he said the entire memories of that timeline came back to him.
Wow. I
And
didn't know
it,
that.
he was going to write a sequel. But after he got all those memories, she said he just thought it was too, it was just too depressing. He didn't want to
Yeah.
keep writing it because he remembered so much about that timeline. He started writing
Wow.
these other books later. You can see his later books are way different than his earlier books. But that she said to go back and watch or read his speech from Metz, France, in 1977, and that speech was one of the ones which had inspired the Wachowskis,
Mm.
who made The Matrix. Right. As an aside, I asked her what would Philip have thought of The Matrix, and she goes, "Well, first he would have said he loved it because it's a great use of his ideas and
Hmm.
it's a great movie." And his second thought would have been, "Let me call my agent and see if I can sue these guys to get some money out of this
Yeah.
for using his ideas." Now, of course, they weren't just his ideas.
Right.
Obviously, The Matrix pulled from a lot of ideas, but she said in that speech, there's a famous line, which I knew about the line, which is why I'd asked her in the speech in 1977. He said, "We are living in a computer programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed. Some
Mm.
alteration occurs in our reality." And I read the rest of that speech, and it turns out the rest of it is he was saying we would have the sense we were reliving the same memories or the same events. We are saying the same things, but slightly differently. Such an impression, we would have the impression of deja vu. And
Yeah.
such an impression is a clue, he called it, that at some prior time, some variable in a computer program was changed uh, by the
Hmm.
programmer or programmers, and he called them the programmer and counter programmers. There were some religious implications there, but he said each one is like almost like a different timeline. So when I read
Yeah.
that speech in its full, it turns out that that line wasn't in the written version of the speech about the computer living in a computer program, but it's the key part because what he's really talking about is does the universe run multiple times? And I wrote another simulation book called The Simulated Multiverse about this idea that perhaps when people are remembering things like the Mandela effect, they're remembering a different run. Uh,
Yes.
but your listeners will appreciate this. So she told me that Philip supposedly was communicating with these entities. She goes, I don't know if they look like aliens or what, but they were entities, and she would just see a blob when he was doing this. So she didn't know, like a mist or something, like
Yeah.
where you can't really see something. It's out of focus. But he said he saw more clearly. And basically, they told him they prevented the assassination of JFK in Orlando. I mean, sorry, in Dallas. And then they ran that timeline, and he got assassinated in Orlando. And then
Right.
they changed the variable again. He got assassinated somewhere else, and they kept changing the variables, and sometimes it led to like a nuclear war scenario or
Wow.
worse scenarios. And so this timeline. So is it possible that this timeline is one of many that is being allowed to run forward? And uh, so we might be doing this ourselves at a
Yeah.
personal level. Like this gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. Like if I hadn't had the heart surgery, would I be here talking to you now? I would be on a different timeline. But perhaps part of me is doing what I like to call the life preview.
Mm.
Near-death experiencers talk about the life review, but some of them also talk about life previews. There was a woman named Natalie Sudman. Have you ever heard of her?
No.
She had a near-death experience. She wrote a book. I can't remember the name, but people can look it up. But she said she was in Iraq, and they had an IED, and everybody was injured, and she had a near-death experience. And she said during that near-death experience, uh, she was in a room. She had a life review. We can talk about life reviews in a moment. But and then afterwards, they said, "Well, if you go back and say you're blind in one eye, what would happen? Okay, now what if you're totally paralyzed for the rest of your life? What would happen? And what if this?" And she said, "It sounds gruesome, but it was actually fun." She was like seeing what would happen
Yeah.
if that's what would happen. And it's kind of like often mothers who have a near death experience will be given the choice of whether to go back or not. And most people say, I want to stay here because everything's great. There's no,
Right.
and then they'll show them what'll happen to their kids if they don't go back,
Right.
and what'll happen to their kids if they do go back. And they're like, okay, well, I'm a mom, I better go back. Right? Usually, not 100% of the time, but
Right.
usually that's the case. And, we're all thankful to our moms for that.
Of course.
uh,
Anita
So
Morjani tells. Have you heard of Anita Morjani?
yes, in fact, I was supposed to speak to her recently.
Oh, you have to talk to her. She's amazing. Tell her Faust said hello.
Oh, I will. Okay, great.
She's an incredible woman, but she also experienced both the life review and also a life preview. I think is the right
Oh,
word,
did she?
right?
That's interesting. Yeah, that's what
Um,
I'm calling it, is a life
yeah,
preview.
and because she had been suffering. I mean, this poor thing she had been riddled with cancer, years of treatment. She was down to 99 pounds, complete failure of every organ, and in a coma when everyone was saying their goodbyes. And then she went out of body, and she had this incredible experience. But she said that, after if you want to hear her story, which is just mind blowing, you could check out my podcast with her or any of her talks about it. But she talks about how she was it was so good to be free of her body. She was in so much pain for so long, she did not want to go back, and she was shown, they were like, you don't have to go back, but your your work is not complete, and there's a lot of people depending on you. Your husband's life, contract and mission is also going to be very, very difficult without you there, And so she was shown glimpses of that. She was shown how fast she would heal. She would go from literally dead 90 pounds, 99, literally 99 tumors to healing. Now, there was nothing
Completely
that they
cancer
could do
free,
to,
right? Yeah.
and then within 6 weeks, and this is all medically documented, within 6 weeks, she was walking out of that fucking hospital without cancer. That is crazy, and it's all documented. It's not woo woo. What she saw came to fruition. So you have to talk to her.
Yeah.
She's so kind, and she would love to talk to you, I'm sure.
Yeah, we were supposed to talk last week, and then we ended up rescheduling. But she was one of my inspirations around near-death
Nice.
experiences. Was her book, because I saw her talk, back in the
Oh,
day.
okay. So yes, you know
I
that.
know who she is, and I knew her story, but I haven't like personally talked to her.
Yeah.
And then the other one was a guy named Daniel Brinkley, who was struck by lightning way
I
back
know.
in the
I've heard
70s.
Daniel speak. Yes, yes.
Yeah,
I
and
got to get him on my podcast. Do you know him?
yeah, he's a good friend of mine now.
Oh man,
And he was shot. Sorry, he was struck by lightning, and he died. And he had like this full,
Yeah.
near-death experience. He wrote a book called "Saved by the Light," and
Saved by the
he's the one that got me really thinking about life reviews and how they fit into simulation theory. Because in the life review, as people who are familiar with it will know, what he said was he called it a holographic panoramic life review.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had to go back to every single moment in your life, but you had to experience it from the other person's point of view. And so he was, an assassin in the military, and he actually shot people. So
Yeah.
he had to experience what it was like to see the bullet coming towards him and to get shot. And then he had to see the ripple effects.
Wow.
And he's the nicest guy now. And he talks about how he was a big bully before his life review. And he's died several times. And
Yeah,
so
he
I
has.
talked to him, he keeps dying. In fact, when I was in the hospital, he was in the hospital right around the same time. I remember I called him, and we were talking about, because he was having some kind of heart surgery at
Yeah.
the time. But he's the nicest guy now, and why? He's got this thick South Carolina accent.
Oh, I mean, as thick as it gets. I mean, it is.
He always says to me, like we were having lunch somewhere, and he goes, I got to be nice to people. You know why, Riz? I'm like, why? And he goes, because I know I got to go and talk to that damn bingo lad again. And he's going to show me another life review.
Yeah.
So it was like,
Oh my God, I heard him talk last year, and he was fucking awesome. He was so funny. He was like, every time I go to the doctor, they're like, how the hell are you even standing here, man? Your levels say you should be dead. And he was like, because I am not this body, man. I'm not this body. When you going to figure it out? He's like, I'll go when I'm ready to go.
That's right. That's right.
It's
Well, so he got me thinking about this. And as a scientist and an engineer, my point is, how does this work? I mean, if you can replay everything. Well, it turns out in Silicon Valley, the same year I was playing the ping pong game, I put on this other VR headset, and we replayed a video game that we had been playing online on a flat screen. And one of the games was CSGO, it was a first-person shooter. And so you could literally be where the other person is, and you could see yourself being shot. So you could go to any XYZ location in this 3D world and it's XYZ comma T. You could go to any time point and view
Wow.
it from any point of view. Now, obviously, we didn't have emotions, which is a key part of the life review, is experiencing the emotions. But this idea that, well, the world is virtual and can be replayed because it's being recorded and you can replay at any time from the other side really got me thinking, and that's what got me linking, the spiritual side with the technological and the science side.
It's so cool. The Mandela effect is so cool. And when I was working with a wonderful teacher, and she taught me. My God, she taught me so much. But she used to say to me, she'd be like, we are constantly shifting timelines, and I was like, I didn't really know what that meant until I started meditating and experiencing a little bit of it. And she was like, I'll give you an example. She was like a lot of people believe, like, this is a big popular one. Half the world remembers the dude from Monopoly, the little figure having a monocle. And the other half is like,
guy, yeah.
what are you talking about? There's no monocle. And then when everyone looks, half of everybody's like, what the fuck? Where did the monocle go? And I don't think there ever was one, but half the people remember one. You know what I mean? Like, and like stuff like that. Like, seems like we shifted with like there's always these glitches in the matrix, right? And I feel like that's the Mandela effect. That's the timeline shift. Sometimes, there's this overlap that happens and it's so subtle and slight that the reality is intact, but some people have a completely different memory of like history of what happened, like I know there's millions of people who were like remember this movie that was made with this comedian Shabazz, his name was
Sinbad.
and Sinbad, and
was the comedian, and the name of the movie was it Shazam or
Shazam?
Shazam.
Yeah. And I could have sworn I remember that movie coming out and bombing, and then they're like, that movie doesn't exist. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? I remember that terrible movie came out, and I look and it's gone. I'm like, what's going on?
And there's a conventional explanation, which is, people are just mistaking, Shazam for Kazam with Shaq, as opposed to Shazam with Sinbad. And what's funny is Sinbad decided to make a little piece of this movie. Later, like a few years ago, just like a little clip, because people remembered it. They kept describing it to him.
Right.
And he's like, okay, I'm going to make a little, But before the internet, so going back to Philip K. Dick, he said what we would need to do is to find a group of people who remembered a different alternate past or present. And before the internet, you couldn't do that. And so the Mandela effect came about in like 2010 by a blogger named Fiona Broom. She was actually I think in Atlanta, at the Dragon Con, where she was at a session with the original Star Trek actors, like Chekhov and Sulu and a couple of those guys. I don't know if William Shatner was there, but it was a few of them. And Trekkies are pretty hardcore. Like, they remember their episodes, and they kept saying, what about this episode where you did this and Spock did that and Kirk did that? And they're like, no, there was no such episode. We never shot that. And so she began to look into it, and then she got to the Mandela, Nelson Mandela memory, and she ended up calling it the Mandela effect.
Wow.
But there's an element of proximity. And so, like, a lot of guys in the world that I live in academia don't take this seriously at all. They're just like, it's just false memories, blah, 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 blah. And I had a buddy of mine from MIT who started working for Google, and I lived right down the road from Google at the time. And he came to visit their office in Mountain View, and we had coffee, and he goes, the simulation is a good explanation for the Mandela effect. And I was surprised, one, because most people from MIT that I know they wouldn't even consider anything like the Mandela effect. Simulation, they might be willing to talk about, but so I got deep into this rabbit hole. And in the simulated multiverse, I really talk about, could this be evidence of multiple timelines? Because the past may not be what we think it is. Now, couple of my favorite Mandela effects are, so the Tiananmen Square. Do you remember the guy who stood in front of the tank and the tank had moved?
Of course.
Did the tank run him over or not?
I thought the tank veered.
Yeah, that was my memory. And that's the majority memory. But there's a minority memory, and that's usually what Mandela effects are, where the tank ran him over. And people will be like really vivid about this. They'll say, man, it was the bloodiest thing I saw on TV ever. And I was on a panel at Contact in the Desert last year with a few people like Paul Hynek, who's
I know Paul, yeah.
Paul's great. And a few other people were on the panel. Anthony Peake and a few others, I think, and we were talking about the Mandela effect, and afterwards I said, okay, how many people remember the tank? And 2 out of the 6 of us, I think, remembered the tank running them over, and 4 of us remembered the majority view, which is what I remember. Now,
Mm.
here's one of my favorites: is the thinker. You know the statue, the thinker.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where is his hand in the thinker?
Isn't it on his chin?
Yeah, it's kind of on his chin, and it's kind of like this. Now, there's a cast of it at Stanford, and I went to see it, and that's about what it is. But yet, there are all these pictures of people with their hand on their forehead, and sometimes they're standing next to the thinker, and it's just a weird thing because the
Yeah.
thinker will have his hand, and then. So I looked at the historical kind of record, and it turns out at the 1910 or so, or 1900 something, bronze unveiling in London of the thinker, there's actually a picture of G.B. Shaw, George Bernard Shaw,
Yeah.
in the pose of the thinker. I mean, that's the name, that's the title of the picture. And he's sitting there like this.
Wow.
And that picture is still available. It's in like some museums where you can find it online. And then finally, okay, your listeners might appreciate this one. The Bible verse changes, right? There are whole websites dedicated to Bible verses that have changed. And the most famous is about in Isaiah about the lion and the lamb. Well, it turns out that's not what it says. It's about the wolf and the lamb. The
Oh,
wolf
really?
with the lamb. Yeah, which is odd, right? Because there are people who have like calendars and things on their wall that have pictures of tattoos with a lion. And so I began to wonder about this. And I said, okay, well, if the Bible, at first I thought, okay, it's just, different translations. So it can't be a big deal. One came from Latin, one came from there. And people online were like, no, it's my King James Bible that I've had since I was a kid. It's the same physical Bible. And now people take their scripture very seriously. So this is what I call proximity, or to a Mandela effect. If you're close to something and you get it wrong, well, then I take it much more seriously than some random guy. Like some people say, Billy Graham, the Reverend, when he died, their parents who used to get his stuff in the mail all the time,
Right.
were like, he died several years ago. We remember his funeral. Like I wouldn't know what year he died, but I might know if Harrison
Right.
Ford, who played Han Solo, if he's still alive or not. But so I started to see, are there other scriptures in the world that have changed? And so I looked at the Quran, which is in Arabic, and it turns out they memorize it word for word.
Oh,
So
yeah,
I was
that's
really
right.
curious. I said, why do they memorize it word for, like the priests? There's actually like a designation
Right.
of a priest who can literally memorize every single word and repeat it to you. I always thought that was stupid. Well, you can just look at the book. Why do you need to
Right.
memorize the Arabic? And there's this one Sufi imam. So Sufi, for those who don't know, is like the mystical aspect of the Middle East. And he said, one of the esoteric reasons, there's the exoteric reason, which is maybe not everybody could read back then, blah, 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 all of that. But the esoteric reason is that there are entities which are allowed to go back in time and change physical objects. They're allowed to but they're not allowed to change your memory. And those are the jinn. Which in the Middle East, and we know of them as genies, right, from
Right.
Aladdin and Disney. And so that was interesting to me because it's tying together this idea of these non-physical entities, time and space, the Mandela effect, scripture, human memory. And so maybe that's what's going on. And that was what I posited in that book.
God, it feels like that has to be going on some level. There's just too many glitches in the matrix for if you were to try to calculate the odds of all these glitches being, even taking into account, how faulty human memory is, but the odds of people remembering the very same specific thing, across vast swaths of the population versus very specific other thing, then it starts to get like, wait a minute. Yes,
in detail. People will describe Nelson Mandela's funeral like Winnie, his wife, took over, the ANC after he died in prison. It's very specific, which is weird.
Very specific. Doc, we had a late start, and I would love to do this again with you, because there's so much to talk about, and I only got through about half my questions. But if I don't leave soon, I'm gonna miss my son's playoff game, and he would be disappointed. But tell everyone where they can find you, where they can follow your work, follow you if you have social media. I know that you're a doctor and an author, and don't always have time for the social media thing, but I'm sure people are going to want to hear more about you.
Yeah, so on X, Twitter, they can reach me at Riz Stanford, just like the university, and on Instagram at Riz Cambridge, just like the city or the university. And then my website is zenentrepreneur.com, which is kind of based off the title of my very first book, which was Zen Entrepreneurship. And there I have my upcoming speaking schedule, and I'll be out in different parts of the country, Los
Very
Angeles
cool,
at the
Doc.
Conscious Life Expo and other places. Yeah.
I'll probably bump into you at the Conscious Life Expo. I'm going to be milling about myself.
Oh,
But
great.
listen, there's so much. We'll have a sequel. We'll get it scheduled. But it's been so much fun, and we could probably talk for days. But there's definitely some more big points I want to get to. So I appreciate your time so much, Doc. And I will probably find you at the Conscious Life Expo and come up behind you, put my arm around you, and say hey.
Sounds
So
great. See you in a few weeks
awesome.
then.
Thank you so much. For everyone listening, if you're listening on YouTube, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Spotify, iTunes, we could use reviews. If you have a moment and you enjoyed this podcast, enjoyed me and the good doctor's conversation, let us know with comments. We're trying to gain subscribership. And also, if you want to support my work further, I have a Patreon page. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thanks, Doc. We'll be in touch soon.